She gave birth 6 times. Only one child lived. Cast aside by her husband for failing to bear a son, stripped of her crown, she died in exile within damp stone walls. Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII, lost not just her children, but her love, her throne, her England. At 50, she breathed her last in lonely silence, leaving behind a tragedy that shook both crown and church. The story of Catherine of Aragon begins in fire and faith. She was born on December 16, 1485, in Alcalá de Henares, Spain, the youngest daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. To the world, they were not just monarchs. They were the Catholic monarchs, rulers who united Spain, crushed rival claimants, and launched the Reconquista. For Catherine, their world of iron and devotion would shape her very soul. Her birth came only months before Columbus sailed westward. Spain stood on the edge of global power. And in the middle of that rising storm stood a little girl destined not for quiet obscurity, but for history's stage. Catherine was not like other princesses. Her education was rigorous, deliberate, and purposeful. Tutors drilled her in Latin, French, and Spanish. She mastered theology, philosophy, and classical literature. She learned to sew, to ride, to dance, but also to argue with priests and to hold her own in political debate. Isabella, her mother, insisted that daughters should be as prepared as sons, for queenship was not decoration, it was survival. From her earliest years, Catherine was told she had a sacred destiny. She was to embody Catholic virtue, defend the faith, and marry into greatness. Every stitch of her gown, every phrase she memorized, was an investment toward that single goal. At court, Catherine absorbed lessons of piety. Her parents prayed daily. They fought wars in God's name. They expelled Jews and Muslims from their kingdoms, uniting Spain under a banner of Catholic uniformity. For Catherine, faith was not merely private devotion. It was identity. It was armor. It was her crown before she ever wore one. But alongside faith came beauty. Chroniclers describe Catherine as petite, with pale skin touched by the Castilian sun, auburn gold hair that shimmered in light, eyes that carried both softness and resolve. She was graceful, but also sturdy, not fragile porcelain, but a living emblem of Spain's strength. By the time she was a teenager, her life had already been mapped. Her parents looked across Europe for alliances, and they found one in England. The Tudor dynasty was young, shaky, still fighting to secure legitimacy after the Wars of the Roses. A Spanish princess could stabilize them. And for Spain, an English alliance meant a foothold in Northern Europe. At just 3 years old, Catherine was formally betrothed to Arthur, Prince of Wales, the eldest son of King Henry VII. She was promised to a boy she had never seen in a land she had never visited. For Catherine, this was not choice. This was duty, and she embraced it. Her letters reveal a girl deeply aware of her role. She wrote of her prayers, her studies, her resolve to serve her future husband and kingdom. At the heart of her writing was not fear, but determination. She was raised to believe she was chosen, not abandoned. Yet beneath the golden silk, shadows always lingered. Dynastic marriages were risks. Women like Catherine were pawns, shipped across seas to cement treaties. Their value lay in their wombs, in their ability to bear sons. And Catherine knew this. She carried it like a burden, even before her wedding dress was sewn. When she reached adolescence, observers began noting her regal poise. She could converse in multiple tongues. She carried herself with dignity beyond her years. At court festivals, she shone. But in private, Catherine spent long hours in devotion, kneeling, whispering prayers, clutching rosary beads until her fingers ached. Faith, for her, was not ceremonial. It was oxygen. Her parents encouraged this piety. Isabella, especially, modeled strength fused with religion. The queen had led armies in battle, wearing armor beneath her royal mantle. Catherine learned that a queen was not merely an ornament beside a king. She could be anchor, conscience, and even commander. As Catherine matured, her betrothal to Arthur grew closer to reality. The English sent envoys to inspect her, to report back on her beauty, her manners, her health. Was she fertile? Was she strong enough to bear sons? Every observation reduced her humanity to dynastic utility. Yet Catherine passed these tests with quiet endurance. She knew what was expected. She knew her life was not her own. Still, there was fire in her veins. Catherine inherited not only her mother's piety, but her will. Isabella had fought wars, reigned over Castile, and brokered treaties with iron resolve. Catherine carried that same steel, even if hidden beneath soft words. She believed her destiny was guided by God, and God, she thought, would not abandon her. By the late 1490s, Europe watched Catherine with anticipation. The Spanish princess was nearly ready to leave her homeland. Across the Channel, England awaited her arrival like dawn after night. A future queen was coming, a bride who could bind two kingdoms. But there was also another layer. Catherine was not only a princess, she was a symbol. To her parents, she was proof of Spain's grandeur. To England, she was insurance against rebellion. To the Catholic Church, she was a vessel to spread and safeguard the faith. Her identity was constructed by others before she even spoke her vows. As she prepared for departure, Catherine lived in a palace of contradictions. She was adored by her attendants, praised for her modesty, yet scrutinized as if she were a horse at market. She prayed for strength, but also dreamed of love. In the secret corners of her mind, perhaps she imagined Arthur not only as duty, but as hope. A boy who would share her burdens, a partner who would ease the weight of destiny. In 1501, that destiny drew near. At 16, Catherine left Spain, sailing north to a land colder, harsher, and stranger than her warm Castilian home. Behind her lay the towers of Granada, the cathedrals of Seville, the royal courts where she had grown into womanhood. Ahead lay mist, rain, and an unfamiliar tongue. As her ship cut through waves, Catherine of Aragon embodied both triumph and tragedy, waiting to unfold. She was the Catholic princess, the daughter of monarchs, the bride of England's heir. And though she did not yet know it, her fate would not only test her faith, but fracture Christendom itself. In November 1501, London prepared for a spectacle. The city hummed with anticipation. The bells of St. Paul's rang out. Torches lit the streets. Crowds pressed against the wooden barriers to glimpse the girl who had come across the sea. Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Spain, bride of England. She was 16. Arthur, Prince of Wales, was 15. Together they embodied the fragile hope of two kingdoms. The Tudors, new to their throne, longed for legitimacy. Spain, triumphant and rich, demanded recognition as Europe's Catholic bulwark. Their marriage was not romance, it was strategy. Still, for Catherine, the day shimmered with grandeur. She entered St. Paul's Cathedral dressed in white satin, her hair flowing loose as tradition demanded of a virgin bride. Jewels glittered across her gown. Her face, pale but resolute, glowed under the candlelight. Onlookers whispered, she was beautiful, radiant, serene, a true princess. Arthur, tall and delicate, stood beside her. His voice was thin, his frame slight. He carried the look of one not made for battlefields, but for books and cloisters. Yet in that moment, he was the Prince of England, the future king, the husband of Spain's proudest daughter. The ceremony was elaborate, echoing through the vast cathedral. Latin chants rose, incense swirled, and Catherine bowed her head with humility. In that sacred space, she became Princess of Wales, a title that carried not only honor, but also expectation. To give England an heir, to secure the Tudor line, to bind two nations with blood. The people rejoiced. London feasted for days. Plays were staged. Wine poured freely. The marriage of Arthur and Catherine was hailed as the dawn of stability. But behind the pageantry, shadows stirred. Arthur's health was weak. Those who saw him up close noticed his pallor, his thin chest, the way he tired easily. Some whispered he would not live long. Catherine could not know how brief their union would be. The young couple retired to Ludlow Castle, far from London's bustle. There, in the damp marches of Wales, they were to learn to rule. But the Welsh climate was harsh, the castle drafty, the air heavy with mist. Within months, Arthur fell ill. Some said it was the sweating sickness. Others guessed tuberculosis. His body, fragile from birth, could not endure. By April 1502, Catherine's new husband was dead. Their marriage had lasted just 5 months. Catherine, the radiant bride, the Catholic princess, was now a widow at 16. Her grief was immense. She had left her homeland, her family, her language, for this boy, for this crown. And now both had slipped away like smoke. She was stranded in a foreign land, her dowry disputed, her future uncertain. In one cruel stroke, Catherine became a pawn once more, caught between courts, treaties, and ambitions that cared little for her heart. Henry VII, Arthur's father, debated her fate. Should she be sent back to Spain? Should she remain in England, remarried to Arthur's younger brother Henry? The question was not about Catherine herself. It was about politics, about money, about alliances. For years, she lived in limbo. Between 1502 and 1509, Catherine remained in England, half forgotten, lodged in drafty palaces, dependent on irregular allowances. She wrote desperate letters to her father, begging for funds, for clarity, for dignity. At times, she was reduced to near poverty, her household unpaid, her servants starving. For a princess raised in splendor, it was humiliation. But Catherine endured. She prayed, she studied, she kept her composure. She reminded herself that she was not merely a widow. She was still the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. She still carried Spain's pride and God's blessing. And in her resilience, people began to admire her not only as a foreign bride, but as a woman of strength. Her fate shifted when young Henry, Arthur's brother, grew into manhood. Unlike Arthur, Henry was vigorous, athletic, handsome. He hunted, jousted, sang, and charmed the court. He saw Catherine not as a political burden, but as a woman of grace and dignity. And Catherine, 8 years older, carried an aura of maturity that captivated him. In 1509, Henry ascended the throne as Henry VIII. One of his first acts was to marry Catherine. It was both duty and desire. He claimed he loved her, that their union was God's will, that Arthur's death had cleared the path for destiny. On June 11th, 1509, they were wed. 2 weeks later, Catherine of Aragon was crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey, side by side with her new husband. The coronation was dazzling. Gold cloths draped the abbey. Crowds surged through London's streets, cheering. Henry, in his prime, looked like the very embodiment of a Renaissance king. Catherine, radiant in velvet and jewels, embodied majesty and virtue. The people adored her. They saw not a foreigner, but a queen who blessed the poor, who prayed with sincerity, who brought dignity to the crown. For Catherine, it was a rebirth. No longer a widow, no longer a pawn in waiting. She was queen. The daughter of Spain now stood as England's first lady. Her marriage to Henry began with love, passion, and shared dreams. Together, they represented youth, hope, and a new age of Tudor glory. But beneath the triumph lingered unspoken truths. Her first marriage had left scars, not just personal, but political. To marry her, Henry had needed a papal dispensation, since canon law forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow. The Pope granted it, on Catherine's solemn testimony that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. That technicality saved her. It also bound her fate to a fragile legal thread. For now, the thread held. For now, she was queen, beloved, triumphant. But Catherine's life had already revealed a cruel pattern. Joy followed by loss, promise followed by shadows. Her youth in England was no fairy tale. It was a prologue to a tragedy still waiting to unfold. And as she stood crowned in Westminster Abbey, she could not know that her greatest trial would not be widowhood or exile, but the empty cradles that lay ahead. At first, the marriage of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon seemed blessed. The young king adored his queen. He showered her with gifts, with words of devotion, with promises that England had never seen such a match. Their court sparkled with pageantry. Music filled the halls. Jousts celebrated Henry's youth and Catherine's grace. People whispered that God himself had smiled upon their union. But in Tudor England, love was not enough. A queen's worth was measured by one thing: children. More precisely, by sons. Catherine knew this. She felt it in her bones from the day of her wedding. Every look from the court, every letter from Spain, every prayer whispered over her in chapel. The message was always the same: bring forth an heir, secure the line, save the throne. In 1509, only months after her coronation, Catherine became pregnant. Hope swelled through the kingdom. The bells rang. The people celebrated. England waited for the cry of a prince. In January 1510, Catherine delivered her first child, a girl, born still. The court fell silent. What had begun in joy ended in mourning. The little body was laid to rest before it even had a name. Catherine, only 24, was crushed. Yet she gathered her strength. She whispered to herself that it was only the beginning, that God would bless her again. Later that same year, she conceived once more. This time, hope returned, stronger than before. In January 1511, Catherine bore a son, Prince Henry. The bells of London roared. Cannons thundered across the Thames. Bonfires lit the night sky. The child was baptized with splendor. England rejoiced. Finally, a Tudor heir. Finally, Catherine's purpose fulfilled. But joy proved fleeting. 52 days later, little Prince Henry was dead. A fever, a sudden decline, gone. The celebrations turned to wails. London's bonfires became funeral flames, and Catherine's heart broke again. She did not stop. She could not stop. Between 1513 and 1518, Catherine endured pregnancy after pregnancy, 6 in all. Each one wrapped in hope, each one ending in loss. Some children were stillborn, Others died within hours, within days. Only one daughter survived, Mary, born in 1516. Mary was healthy, strong, and bright. Catherine clutched her with a devotion fierce as fire. She dressed her in fine linens. She thanked God daily for this single life spared. But in the eyes of the court, Mary's survival was not enough. She was not a boy. She could not inherit the throne without challenge. And Catherine knew it. Every cradle that stood empty deepened her despair. Imagine the silence, the rooms prepared with silk blankets, the wet nurses waiting, the lullabies unsung. Time and again, Catherine entered chambers heavy with anticipation, only to leave them draped in black. Henry mourned too at first. He stood beside her. He comforted her. He whispered of their love, of God's mysterious will. But slowly, inevitably, his patience frayed. He wanted a son. He needed a son. England's future demanded it. And each time Catherine's womb failed to deliver, Henry's frustration grew. For Catherine, the losses became more than grief. They became obsession. She prayed night and day. She begged saints for mercy. She made pilgrimages, knelt on cold stone floors, fasted, wept, pleaded. Her body, bruised by childbirth, became a battlefield of faith. Every time she felt the stir of life within her, she dared to hope again. Every miscarriage tore her deeper into despair. And the whispers began. Some said God had cursed her. Others claimed her marriage was unlawful, that by marrying her husband's brother, Henry had brought down divine judgment. Each failed pregnancy became ammunition for Henry's enemies, a reason to question his reign. Catherine bore not only her private agony, but the weight of England's doubt. Still, she never faltered in duty. She continued to support Henry in politics. She served as regent when he waged war in France. In 1513, she even ordered English troops against Scotland, winning victory while Henry was abroad. She was more than wife, more than mother. She was a ruler in her own right. But history did not count regency as legacy. It counted heirs. The contrast was brutal. In private, Catherine was a grieving mother, haunted by tiny graves and empty cradles. In public, she was a queen radiant with dignity, draped in velvet, crowned with jewels, her face composed. She carried the mask of majesty even as her heart bled beneath it. One image stands eternal. Catherine walking through palace corridors, passing by the nursery wing, curtains drawn, rocking chairs still, the silence pressing like a tomb. She prayed, but even prayer could not erase the sound of her own footsteps echoing through the emptiness. By 1518, Catherine was past her prime childbearing years. Each new pregnancy carried more risk, more fear. She was nearing 40, her face lined with grief, her body weary. Still, she clung to Mary, her only surviving child, with unshakable devotion. Yet for Henry, Mary was not enough. He still dreamed of a son to joust beside him, to ride into battle, to inherit his throne without dispute. Catherine had given him loyalty, dignity, courage, faith, but not what he demanded most. And in that absence, cracks began to form. Cracks in their marriage, cracks in the kingdom, cracks that would eventually split the church itself. For now, Catherine endured. She was the queen, she was the wife. She was the mother who had lost nearly everything yet refused to break. But behind every smile, every prayer, every act of devotion, lay a truth she could never escape. Her cradle was empty, her womb had failed her, and the shadow of those lost children hung over England's throne like a silent curse. Every queen wears a crown, but Catherine of Aragon also wore a shadow. It followed her through every hallway. It lingered in every chapel, It whispered in the stillness of night. That shadow was grief. The grief of a mother who had cradled 6 infants, but buried nearly all. She feared her own body. Each time her belly swelled, her heart raced not only with hope, but with dread. She had known too many disappointments, too many funerals. Every contraction became a question. Would this be life or death? Her faith was fierce. Catherine was never without her rosary. She prayed until her knees bruised on stone floors. She whispered to saints, to Mary, the Mother of God, to Christ himself. She begged. She bargained. She asked why. Yet the heavens remained silent. In her chambers, the evidence of loss was everywhere. Tiny cradles draped with unused linens, nurses dismissed, their arms empty, midwives stepping softly through corridors where no infant's cry was heard. The silence was louder than any sound. It was unbearable. And still, she tried. Not because she wished for herself, but because she carried England on her shoulders. A queen was not a woman in the eyes of the world. She was a vessel, a womb, a means to secure the crown. Catherine knew that every miscarriage deepened Henry's disappointment, and with it, the peril of her position. At court, people began to murmur. Perhaps she was cursed. Perhaps the marriage itself was cursed. After all, she had been Arthur's wife first. Henry was her brother-in-law. Was this God's punishment? Each failure fed the rumors. Each stillborn child was treated not only as tragedy, but as omen. Catherine, however, would not bend to despair publicly. She rose each day with dignity. She dressed in fine gowns. She carried herself with queenly composure. She sat beside Henry in council, her head high, her voice calm. To the world, she remained serene. But in the private dark of her chambers, she wept until her body shook. Her relationship with Mary, her only surviving child, became her lifeline. Mary was not just a daughter. She was Catherine's proof that she had not failed completely. Catherine poured her love into her. She oversaw her education, ensuring Mary inherited the same rigor and devotion that Isabella had given her. The bond was unbreakable. Yet even that bond was shadowed by fear. Catherine knew Mary's survival did not satisfy the demands of dynasty. She knew Henry wanted more, and that knowledge haunted her. To bear one daughter was not enough for a Tudor queen, not in a world where men believed only a son could guard the throne. Catherine's prayers became pleas not for herself, but for Mary's future. She prayed her daughter would be accepted. She prayed that somehow God would turn weakness into strength. The stress gnawed at her health. She suffered fainting spells, waves of exhaustion, long bouts of melancholy. Her body was worn by years of childbearing. Her spirit was worn by endless mourning. Yet she pressed on, insisting on her duty, insisting she was still England's rightful queen and Henry's true wife. At times, Catherine confided her anguish to close friends. To them, she admitted the terror of approaching childbirth, the way her hands trembled before she lay down in a birthing bed. She confessed the visions that haunted her, the faces of children she never got to raise, the cries she never heard. But beyond those private walls, she never allowed herself to appear weak. She lived in contradiction. A mother bereft, a queen unbroken. Even Henry, who once loved her deeply, could not escape the weight of those empty cradles. He comforted her less. He sought distractions in sport, in courtly flirtations, in Anne Boleyn's dark eyes. Catherine felt his absence long before he abandoned her outright. That absence deepened her wound. What Catherine endured was more than the loss of children. It was the erosion of her very identity. She had been raised to believe that God's blessing would manifest through her womb, that her role as mother and queen were inseparable. Yet the more she prayed, the more she failed. The more she asked whether God had turned his face away. But Catherine's strength was her refusal to despair in silence. She wore her grief with grace. She clung to her titles. She reminded all who would listen that she was still queen, still Henry's lawful wife, still chosen by God. Her willpower became her weapon. If she could not give Henry a son, she would give him unshakable loyalty. If she could not fill the nurseries, she would fill the kingdom with dignity. Still, behind the grandeur, she remained haunted. The queen who heard lullabies only in dreams. The woman who walked past empty cradles as if they were tombs. The mother who could never escape the echo of silence where a child's cry should have been. And that silence, more than Henry's coldness, more than courtly gossip, more than political danger, became the cage she could never leave. Catherine of Aragon was not just a queen. She was a mother marked by loss, a woman who carried grief like a crown. Her faith did not save her from sorrow. Her prayers did not fill the cradle. And as the years passed, the haunted mother would soon become the unwanted wife. At the beginning, Henry VIII loved Catherine of Aragon. There is no doubt. He wrote her letters filled with affection. He leaned on her wisdom when he was young and unsteady. Together they laughed, hunted, and prayed. For years theirs was a marriage that looked solid, even enviable. But love, in the Tudor court, was never only love. It was power, it was politics, and it was legacy. Henry was obsessed with legacy. He was the second king of a new dynasty. His father, Henry VII, had clawed the throne from the ruins of the Wars of the Roses. One generation of Tudors had ruled. But the dynasty's hold on power was fragile. Without a son, everything Henry's father had built could collapse. Rival claimants lurked. Foreign powers watched. The fate of England rested in the cradle. At first, Henry believed Catherine would give him that security. She was strong, pious, dignified. She had already proven she could govern. When he left for war, she served as regent and crushed Scotland at Flodden Field. She was not a weak queen. She was formidable. But all of it, all her loyalty, her governance, her devotion, was overshadowed by one fact. She had not given him a son who lived. By the time Henry turned 40, frustration gnawed at him. Mary, his daughter, grew bright and capable, but she was not male. Henry began to convince himself that God had cursed his marriage, that by marrying his brother's widow, he had broken divine law. It was easier to blame heaven than to admit fate had denied him. And into this void stepped Anne Boleyn. She was everything Catherine no longer was, young, unwed, alluring. Where Catherine carried the weight of grief, Anne carried a dangerous charm. She laughed when others whispered. She argued boldly. She promised not only her body, but her promise: sons. Henry was captivated. What had once been patience toward Catherine now turned cold. The tenderness he once showed her turned sharp. He stopped visiting her chambers. He ceased speaking of their shared past. He began to view her not as his beloved wife, but as an obstacle, a wall between him and the future he craved. For Catherine, this was betrayal twice over. First, as a wife. She had stood beside him through triumph and loss, given him her youth, her loyalty, her prayers. Now she was discarded for a younger face. Second, as a mother. Every wound from every lost child deepened as Henry turned away, as if those failures were hers alone. She could feel him slipping away. The late-night councils, the secret letters, the laughter at Anne's table. Catherine knew her husband's heart was elsewhere. But she also knew she was still his lawful wife, God's chosen queen. She refused to yield. She would not agree to annulment. She would not surrender her crown. Henry's hunger grew desperate. He needed a son. He was convinced of it. Without one, he feared England would fall into chaos after his death. Rival families would rise. Civil war would return. His dynasty, his very name, would vanish. And so he told himself his desire for Anne, his rejection of Catherine, his defiance of Rome, all of it was justified. In truth, it was obsession. Obsession dressed as destiny. The court felt the shift. Courtiers once loyal to Catherine began to hedge their words. They courted Anne, flattered her, aligned themselves with the rising star. Catherine, isolated, leaned more heavily on her faith. She fasted more, prayed harder, clung to her title. She reminded anyone who would listen, "I am the queen. I am Henry's true wife. God is my witness." But Henry was already looking past her, already imagining sons who had not yet been born, already dreaming of a dynasty secured through Anne's womb. Catherine's devotion, once a source of comfort, now seemed like a chain he longed to break. The tragedy was not only personal, it was political. Catherine had been the bridge to Spain. Her marriage had bound England to one of Europe's most powerful thrones. Now, Henry was willing to risk that alliance, to sever ties with Rome, to throw his country into religious upheaval, all for a son who did not yet exist. For Catherine, every smile Anne received was another cut. Every glance from Henry to his mistress was another humiliation. She was not simply losing her husband. She was watching her life's purpose unravel. She had been raised to be queen, to unite dynasties, to safeguard Christendom. And now she was reduced to whispers in cold corridors, to isolation in palaces where she no longer felt welcome. Still, she did not surrender. She confronted Henry directly. She told him she was his wife before God. She told him their marriage was valid. She told him she would never agree to annulment. She spoke with a dignity that silenced even her enemies. She would rather die queen than live dishonored. Henry's heart hardened further. Her resistance only fueled his determination. He began the process that would shake all of Europe, the king's great matter. For Catherine, the betrayal was complete. She was not only unloved, she was unwanted. She was in the way. And yet, she remained steadfast. She clung to Mary, to her faith, to her title. She refused to bend. In her defiance, she revealed a strength Henry could never erase. But that strength came at a terrible cost. Her marriage was broken, her crown was slipping, and soon, her name itself would be torn from her. Henry's hunger for an heir was no longer just a wound in her marriage. It was a fire that would burn down everything she had built. The crown is not just metal and jewels. It is identity. It is life. It is the invisible weight that shapes every breath a queen takes. And in the 1520s, Catherine of Aragon felt that crown slipping from her head. Henry VIII was determined. He called it the king's great matter. What he meant was this: his marriage to Catherine must end. He demanded annulment, not divorce, because divorce would admit that he had failed. Annulment meant his marriage had never been valid in God's eyes. And for that claim, he needed proof. Henry found his argument in Scripture. The book of Leviticus declared, "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. they shall be childless." Henry seized on the verse as prophecy. Arthur had been Catherine's husband. Therefore, their union was cursed. Therefore, God had closed Catherine's womb. Therefore, the marriage must be undone. Catherine rejected it outright. She swore before God and man that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. She was pure when she married Henry. She reminded him, and the Pope, that their union had received papal dispensation years ago. Their marriage was lawful. Their daughter Mary was legitimate. She would not allow Henry to rewrite her life as sin. The courtroom drama unfolded like theater. Cardinals Wolsey and Campeggio sat in judgment at Blackfriars in 1529. Catherine stood before them in full dignity, her Spanish pride burning through every word. When asked to submit to Henry's argument, she refused. Instead, she fell to her knees before her husband and spoke directly to him. She reminded him of their 20 years together, of her loyalty, her prayers, her suffering. She declared, "I take God to witness I have been to you a true, humble, and obedient wife, ever conformable to your will and pleasure." She begged him to look her in the eyes and tell her she had been false. Henry could not. He sat silent, humiliated by her courage. The court was shaken. The people murmured. Catherine had won hearts, if not verdicts. But Henry was king. He would not be denied. When the Pope refused to grant annulment, Henry made a decision that would tear Christendom apart. He broke from Rome. He declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. No pope, no foreign power would dictate his marriage. With Parliament's Act of Supremacy in 1534, Henry seized control, and with that control, he stripped Catherine of her title. No longer Queen of England, no longer the rightful wife. She was reduced to Dowager Princess of Wales, the title of Arthur's widow. It was meant as insult, as humiliation, as erasure. For Catherine, the degradation was unbearable. To her, she remained Henry's lawful wife, the only queen chosen by God. But to the court, she was now a relic, cast aside in favor of Anne Boleyn. Her servants were dismissed, her finances were cut, her name was erased from official prayers. The crown she had worn with dignity was placed on another woman's head. Imagine the scene. A woman who had been queen for nearly a quarter century, mother to England's princess, consort to a king, was suddenly treated as if she were nothing. She was forced from palace to palace, shuffled into drafty castles in the countryside. Her household was reduced to a skeleton staff. She was denied access to her daughter Mary, the greatest punishment of all. Yet Catherine never yielded. She continued to call herself Queen. She signed her letters, Catherine the Queen. She refused to recognize Anne Boleyn as lawful wife. She clung to her faith as anchor. She told friends she would rather die than surrender her honor. Her courage inspired many. Ordinary people still called her the good Queen Catherine. They prayed for her. They whispered against Henry's cruelty. To them, Catherine was not just a discarded wife. She was a martyr to duty, to faith, to loyalty. But the isolation cut deep. In castles like the Moor and Kimbolton, she walked cold halls alone. No council meetings, no courtly festivals, no Mary. The silence was worse than chains. Henry had not killed her body, but he had tried to kill her name, and still she resisted. She told envoys from Spain she was queen. She told her servants she was queen. She told herself she was queen. Each declaration was both defiance and prayer. But the reality was stark. Her crown had been taken. Her husband had abandoned her. Her child had been stolen from her arms. Catherine of Aragon had entered England as a radiant bride. She had worn the crown with grace for 2 decades. Now she was stripped of it, stripped of love, stripped of dignity. Yet in losing everything, she found something indestructible: her will, her faith, her refusal to break. Henry could remove her crown, but he could not erase her courage, and that courage would carry her into exile, a queen in name, a prisoner in truth. A queen without a crown is still a queen in her own heart. Catherine of Aragon believed this with every breath she took. And so, when Henry VIII cast her aside, she did not crumble. She resisted. She endured. But endurance came at a cost. Her life, once filled with ceremony and splendor, shrank into cold, forgotten rooms. After the annulment, Catherine was ordered to leave the royal palaces. She was moved from residence to residence. The Moor, Buckden, finally Kimbolton Castle. Each move pushed her further into obscurity. Each castle was smaller, colder, more isolated. The message was clear. She was no longer welcome at court, no longer to be seen by the world. The cruelty went deeper. Henry forbade her from seeing her daughter, Mary, the one child who had survived, the bond that had kept her spirit alive. Letters were censored, visits denied. For Catherine, this was agony worse than the loss of her crown. She had endured miscarriages, stillbirths, humiliation. But to be torn from Mary was to tear her heart in half. At Kimbolton, Catherine's world narrowed. The castle was damp, drafty, and remote. Its stone corridors echoed with silence. Servants spoke in whispers. Her household, once bustling with dozens of attendants, was reduced to a handful of loyal companions. Meals were plain, rooms were bare. A woman who had once dined beneath golden ceilings now ate in dim candlelight, her hands cold even as she prayed. And yet, she never yielded her title. To everyone around her, she declared, "I am the Queen, the King's lawful wife, the only Queen of England." It was not delusion, it was defiance. She wrote to her nephew, Emperor Charles V, begging for intervention. She pleaded her case before the Pope. She demanded justice from God and man. But justice never came. Rome hesitated. Spain maneuvered. Europe watched, but did not act. Politics moved too slowly. Henry moved too fast. Catherine's cause became less about restoration and more about survival. Her isolation grew heavier as Anne Boleyn rose higher. Anne bore a daughter, Elizabeth. And though she failed to produce the son Henry craved, she still eclipsed Catherine in influence. At court, people began to bow to Anne, whisper her name in admiration or fear. Catherine's name was erased from prayers, her image struck from coins. To many, she no longer existed. But to the people, she was still beloved. In taverns and marketplaces, they whispered of the good Queen Catherine. They cursed Anne Boleyn as a usurper. They told stories of Catherine's kindness, her generosity, her devotion. Even in exile, she was more queen in their hearts than Anne was on the throne. Catherine drew strength from this hidden loyalty. Her attendants described her as calm, dignified, unwavering. She dressed simply but regally. She prayed for hours. She kept her composure even when her health began to fail. She spoke of Mary constantly, her one true treasure. She never allowed Henry's rejection to define her. She defined herself. And yet, loneliness gnawed at her. Nights at Kimbolton were long. The wind howled through the towers. Her chambers, once warmed by courtiers and musicians, now echoed with emptiness. Catherine read scripture by firelight, her eyes straining as her body weakened. She lived like a prisoner, though no chains bound her. Her prison was made of silence, distance, and abandonment. One image survives in letters. Catherine sitting by a narrow window at Kimbolton, wrapped in layers of wool, staring out at a frozen landscape. Snow falling over barren fields, her breath clouding the glass. The Queen of England reduced to a lonely figure in a forgotten castle. Still, she never abandoned hope. Not hope of reconciliation with Henry. She knew that was gone. But hope that history and heaven would remember her truth. Hope that Mary would one day inherit her rightful place. Hope that her suffering meant something greater than humiliation. Her letters in these years burn with dignity. To Henry, she wrote with respect but firmness, always calling herself his wife. To her daughter, she wrote words of love, reminders of faith, instructions to remain strong. To her allies, she wrote appeals for justice, though she knew few would risk Henry's wrath. She was alone, but not broken. She was forgotten by power, but not by conscience. Every exile is a kind of death, but for Catherine, exile also became testimony. Testimony that a woman could be discarded by kings, yet remain sovereign in her soul. Testimony that faith could survive humiliation. Testimony that love for a child could endure separation. And so Catherine of Aragon lived out her final years in exile. A queen without a throne, a wife without a husband, a mother without her daughter, but not without dignity, never without faith. In those cold stone walls, she carved her legacy, not through victory, not through power, but through endurance. And endurance, in the end, became her crown. By the mid-1530s, Catherine of Aragon was fading. Her body, once strong, was breaking under the weight of years of pregnancies, fasting, and sorrow. At Kimbolton Castle, her face grew pale, her movements slower, her voice softer, but even in decline, her presence unsettled Henry's court. She was out of sight, yet never out of mind. And with her weakening health came whispers. Rumors spread like smoke through taverns, markets, even palace halls. Some said Catherine was sick from natural causes. Others claimed she was poisoned. The name whispered in connection to this dark suspicion was Anne Boleyn, the woman who had replaced her. The truth was murkier. Modern historians believe Catherine suffered from cancer, likely of the heart or cervix. Symptoms recorded at the time, chest pain, weakness, swelling, suggest disease, not poison. But 16th century England lived on rumor as much as fact. And the people, already hostile to Anne, found the story of poisoning too easy to believe. It was convenient. Anne was despised by many as the concubine. Henry was accused of cruelty. Catherine was beloved. If she died in suffering, surely it must have been at their hands. The story of poison transformed Catherine into something more than a discarded wife. It made her a martyr. In her last months, Catherine endured constant pain. She could no longer walk freely. She spent long hours in bed, attended by a few loyal servants. Her appetite waned, her strength drained away, and yet she still carried herself with dignity. She dressed simply but neatly. She prayed daily, whispering the rosary with trembling fingers. Even as her body failed, her spirit burned. To visitors, she repeated her truth. She was Henry's lawful wife. Mary was his only legitimate child. Nothing, not annulments, not Anne, not Parliament, not the Pope's hesitation, could erase that. She believed God had given her this suffering as proof of her loyalty. If she must die in exile, she would die a queen in her own heart. But outside her chamber, shadows lengthened. Whispers grew that Catherine's death was not far. Henry and Anne, it was said, celebrated the thought. One Spanish envoy reported that Anne wore yellow when the rumors of Catherine's illness reached court, the color of joy, not mourning. The symbolism cut deep. While Catherine shivered in her damp chamber, her rival strutted in silks, preparing for the future. While Catherine prayed for her daughter's safety, Henry dreamed of sons with Anne. The contrast was cruel, and everyone could see it. The people pitied Catherine more fiercely as the rumors swirled. In marketplaces, they called her the true queen. They told each other that she was dying for her faith, dying for her dignity. Priests preached quietly in her favor. The legend of her sainthood began before her body was even cold. One detail haunted her final months. When her body was later examined, her heart was said to appear blackened and shrunken. To some, this confirmed poison. To others, it was proof of cancer, but to her supporters, it was symbol. Catherine had died with a heart literally consumed by grief, by betrayal, by Henry's rejection. It became part of her mythology. Imagine her final nights, the wind rattling against Kimbolton stone, the fire burning low, Catherine lying in her chamber, whispering prayers, clutching her crucifix, her attendants hovering quietly, knowing the end was near. Outside, the kingdom spun with rumor, but inside, the silence was absolute. Even then, Catherine thought not of revenge, but of love. In her last letter to Henry, she wrote with forgiveness, not bitterness. She begged him to care for Mary. She promised to pray for him, even as he abandoned her. Her words were full of sorrow, but also grace. She died as she had lived, a woman of faith, refusing to curse even the man who destroyed her. And so the shadows grew. Catherine of Aragon was no longer just a queen in exile. She was becoming something else, a figure of legend. A woman transformed by rumor into a saint. A wronged wife turned into a martyr. Henry had tried to erase her. Anne had tried to replace her. But in the silence of Kimbolton, Catherine's suffering gave her a different kind of crown. The crown of memory. The crown of dignity. The crown that no king could strip away. The morning was gray. Cold air seeped through the cracks in Kimbolton Castle. The walls dripped with damp. And inside, Catherine of Aragon, once Queen of England, lay dying. It was January 7th, 1536. She was only 50 years old. Her body had weakened beyond repair. Years of pregnancies, fasting, sorrow, and isolation had drained her strength. Her attendants described her as pale, her face thin, her breath shallow. Yet even in her final hours, she held herself with dignity. She insisted on proper prayers. She clutched her crucifix. She whispered her faith into the silence. There was no courtly procession, no husband by her side, no daughter to hold her hand. Catherine died not as the queen she had been for 2 decades, but as a prisoner in all but name. Her last thoughts were of Mary. She had not seen her daughter in years. She had begged Henry for the reunion, begged to be allowed to embrace the one child who survived. The pleas had been ignored. Mary remained apart, as if she too were erased. Catherine's greatest sorrow was not her crown, not her exile, but the absence of her child in the moment she needed her most. And yet, she forgave. Her final letter to Henry spoke not of anger, but of grace. She asked him to care for Mary, to be a good father, to live in God's favor. She promised to pray for him. She ended not as a bitter wife, but as a woman who clung to her faith, even when it had given her little comfort in life. When she died, the news spread quickly. To her attendants, it was devastation. They wept openly, calling her the true queen. To the people, it was heartbreak. Across England, ordinary men and women remembered her kindness, her generosity, her devotion. They whispered of her suffering. They said she had died a martyr. They mourned her as if she had been their queen still. But at court, the reaction was darker. Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn wore yellow. Some said it was mourning in Spanish custom. Others believed it was celebration, a cruel display of triumph. Banquets were held. Smiles were seen where tears should have been. The contrast between Catherine's lonely death and Henry's courtly festivities left scars on England's memory. Her funeral was small, unworthy of a queen. She was buried not at Westminster Abbey, where kings and queens rested, but at Peterborough Cathedral, with the diminished title of Dowager Princess of Wales. Even in death, Henry denied her the honor that had been hers for 20 years. Her coffin was plain, her procession meager. Yet those who followed her wept with a devotion no gilded crown could buy. One detail haunted those who prepared her body. Her heart, when examined, appeared blackened and shrunken. To some, it was a sign of poison. To others, disease. To many, it was metaphor. Catherine's heart had been consumed by grief, by betrayal, by exile. Whether natural or unnatural, it became a symbol. She had died with a broken heart, in the truest sense. Imagine the scene in that cold chamber at Kimbolton. The fire burning low. The crucifix clutched tight in her frail hands. The whispered prayers of her servants. A life of faith ending not in triumph, but in quiet endurance. She who had once been crowned amid splendor now lay in a simple coffin, a queen diminished in title, but not in memory. Her death changed everything. To Henry, it seemed a release. At last, he was free of the wife who refused to yield, free to build his future with Anne. But only months later, Anne herself would fall, arrested, condemned, and executed. The queen who replaced Catherine would lose her crown and her head. The cycle of Tudor tragedy turned swiftly. For Mary, Catherine's death was unbearable. She had lost not only her mother, but her defender, her anchor, her shield. Henry demanded she deny Catherine's legitimacy and call herself a bastard. But Mary never forgot who she was. She never forgot Catherine's love. Her grief became resolve. History remembers Catherine not for her defeat, but for her endurance. She was the queen who refused to break, the woman who held to her faith, her title, her daughter, even when stripped of everything else. She was buried far from the splendor she deserved, but her memory glowed brighter than the pomp of Henry's court. On that cold January day, Catherine of Aragon breathed her last. But in her death, she became more than queen. She became a symbol of loyalty, of dignity, of faith unbroken by betrayal. Henry stripped her of her crown, but he could not strip her of her legacy. Catherine of Aragon lost her crown, she lost her husband. She lost 6 children, but she never lost herself. Her death in exile did not silence her story. It gave it power. Because Henry's quest to cast her aside did more than wound a woman. It tore England from Rome. It fractured Christendom. It set fire to centuries of faith and tradition. And it all began with one queen who refused to yield. Catherine became more than a wife abandoned. She became the measure of loyalty, the symbol of dignity, the embodiment of endurance. Her daughter, Mary, carried her memory like armor. Years later, she would ascend the throne, not as the bastard Henry declared her, but as Queen of England. Catherine's blood still flowed through the crown. Her defiance had not been in vain. In the end, Catherine's tragedy was also her triumph. Not in victory, not in power, but in the quiet strength of a woman who endured humiliation with grace. She showed that crowns can be taken, titles can be stripped, but character, faith, love remain untouchable. And so history remembers her not as the discarded wife of Henry VIII, but as Catherine of Aragon, queen, mother, martyr of dignity. Her story reminds us of a truth both simple and eternal. Power fades, beauty dies, thrones crumble, but the courage to stand with grace in suffering, that endures.